One day, there will be a new Jerusalem which will represent the final and everlasting reconciliation between God and his people, forever in the glorious light and presence of his love.
You're tuned in to Mission 66, where the Bible comes alive, one book, one chapter at a time. John Matthews and Esther Sisulu are diving into the book of Numbers. If you've got your study guide, follow along. And as you do, ask God to show you something new, something real.
Today, we have come to the last chapters in our series in the book of Numbers, which is the fourth book in the Bible. And joining us now is our teacher, John Matthews, who will lead us into these final chapters as we look at chapters 33 through to 36 with the theme, Between the Past and the Future.
Esther, thank you very much. So good to be with you, and a very warm welcome to Mission 66, wherever you join us from today. Great to have your company. And here we are. We're nearing the end of the book of Numbers, and we see here a kind of recap, an overview of everything that's happened to the Israelites under Moses from the time that they left Egypt through that long journey through the deserts of Sinai to the last preparations before they enter the promised land. Chapter 33 is calling to their memories that incredible departure from Egypt, and it says, "These are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. And Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by stage, by command of the Lord, and these are their stages according to their starting places." And so what follows then is an itinerary. Ever since they left Ramses in Egypt, right after that first Passover. Now, I'll not list all the places where they went and all the different stops that they made throughout the deserts of Sinai, but it was recorded that they reached the plains of Moab just across the Jordan River from Jericho, and that would be the first city that they would have to conquer. We'll read about that during our episode when we get to the book of Joshua. We should also notice verse 48, where it says, "Aaron, the brother of Moses, died on Mount Hor at the age of 123. And then right after that, at the end of chapter 33, we find this summary of the regulations which God defined for his people when they arrived in Canaan. They were to drive out the wicked people who'd inhabited the land. And there is actually a dire warning at the very end of chapter 33 that says, if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them who you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell, and I will do to you as I thought to do to them." God really doesn't want that wickedness, their wickedness, to rub off on his people. And then in chapter 34, we discover the boundaries of the promised land. It says, "Command the people of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan," this is the land that shall fall to you for an inheritance, the land of Canaan defined by its borders, "your south side shall be from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom, and your southern border shall run from the end of the Salt Sea," that is the Dead Sea, "on the east, and your border shall turn south of the ascent of Akrabim, and cross to Zin, and its limit shall be south of Kadesh Barnea. Then it shall go on to Hazar Adar, and pass along to Asmon, and the border shall turn from Asmon to the brook of Egypt, and its limit shall be at the sea," and that is the Mediterranean Sea. And after that, you have the northern boundary, which begins at the Mediterranean, going to Mount Hor until Lebo Hamath in the region close to Lebanon. For your eastern boundary, says verse 10, goes from Hazar Enan to Shechem. And this boundary on the eastern side, the Bible says here that it went down along the Jordan, ending at the Dead Sea. And it says, this will be your land with its boundaries on every side. Now, the land that I've just described there is actually a little bit bigger than the present-day territory of Israel, but it does establish the land that was given to the people of Israel by God. And it was the fulfillment of a promise made to Abraham that they would possess the entire land. And then chapter 34 ends with a list of the tribal chiefs who are named, especially mentioning Eleazar as the chief priest and Joshua, who became the military leader. And then chapter 35 has two topics. As we've already noted, the Levites were not given land as an inheritance, but they did share 48 specific cities and the pasture land around each of those cities. And that included 42 cities where they would dwell, another 6 cities which were to be called cities of refuge. And that is interesting because verse 11 tells us the purpose of a city of refuge. It says that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. In other words, if somebody accidentally killed another person, they could go to one of the cities of refuge where they'd be kept safe until the trial was held. It was effectively a matter of protective custody, and they were to be considered innocent until proven guilty in court. So the city of refuge would protect them from anybody who sought to execute them before standing trial. But as verse 16 goes on, it says, but if he, that is the killer, strikes him down with an iron object so that he dies, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. And if he struck him down with a stone stool that could cause death and he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. Or if he struck him down with a wooden tool that could cause death and he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred or hurled something at him lying in wait so that he died, or in enmity struck him down with his hand so that he died, then he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So who is the avenger of blood? Well, we'll chat about that in a few moments. Verse 22, but if he pushed him suddenly without enmity or hurled anything on him without lying in wait or used a stone that could cause death and without seeing dropped it on him so that he died, though he was not his enemy and did not seek his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules. And the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he had fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who is anointed with the holy oil. But if the manslayer shall at any time go beyond the boundaries of his city of refuge to which he fled, and the avenger of blood finds him outside the boundaries of his city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood, for the accused must remain in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to the land of his possession. And these things shall be for a statute and rule for you throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. And God wanted to be certain that those who were innocent would not be put to death, but those who were guilty of murder would. This is verse 30. If anybody kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. And finally, in chapter 36, we have a recap on the case with Zelophehad's daughters. Remember, Zelophehad had 5 daughters, no sons, which were statistically speaking unusual. So a bit of an exception was made, making the girls heir to their father's property since there was no son to give it to. And the girls were afraid that if they got married, their land would be confiscated by the family of their husband. So Moses had to declare, at God's direction, that no inheritance could be transferred from one tribe to another. That way, if a daughter who inherited her father's property got married, neither side of the family would lose their properties. And then Numbers ends with each of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad getting married, and everyone involved gets to keep their inheritance. So, on that note, we finish the book of Numbers, and the people of Israel are just about to embark on their final step of this great adventure, or this journey, which we'll look at when we get to the book of Joshua. That is the conquest of Canaan. But the people could look back at the past and look forward to the future, and God was with them on every successful step of their journey, and God is always victorious, and he will lead his people on, accomplishing his plans and honouring his covenants despite our weakness.
You're listening to Mission 66, and we've just heard from our teacher, John Matthews. I'm Esther, your host. And, John, as we look at what you've covered here through these chapters, what do you think is the significance of the list of places and the locations referenced back in chapter 33?
Yeah, there's a lot of them in the book of Numbers, so it's called, really, isn't it? That's the reason why it's called. And I think in this case, Esther, it may have been just so there would be a written record of Israel's wanderings. It's a historical account, just like there needed to be lists of genealogy so that people in the future would know who the Hebrews were. And so we see details included. Chapter 33 is an example of that, complete with names and locations that can be confirmed and researched. And we can construct a map of the Israelites' journey from Egypt to Canaan using the information given us in chapter 33. And the genealogies, in a similar fashion, answer those who may say, well, this never happened. In fact, the genealogies that we find in both the Old and the New Testaments go forward from Adam, the first ever man, to Jesus Christ, right the way through. It's charted, and backward from Christ to Adam. So look, the Bible is far, far from a fairy tale. These things are a matter of history, and they can be researched. And archaeology has borne out the existence of the locations that we find mentioned in the Bible, and historians from ancient times confirm biblical narratives too. And many people understandably try to discredit the Bible. It's part of the work of the opposition that the devil provides. But the attempts have always failed. And so we know that the Bible is completely reliable from many, many different facets, and that includes as an historical account. So we can trust the Bible to tell the truth about real places in a real historical and geographical context. And that means we can trust the Bible when it talks about God, about man, about Jesus, about our need of salvation. And just as Moses charted the progress of the Israelites through the wilderness, we too can keep a journal of our spiritual journeys day by day, so that we can look back and see where God has led us from and where he's leading us to. We can see where we've come from, spiritually speaking as well, and years from now, how far we've come.
Well, I have to say, John, that is a regular practice of mine as well, to just document the things that God continues to do in my life and to make reference and to really give him the glory for what he continues to do. And I'm really glad that you brought that up. But I do now want to pivot to chapter 35, as it talks about the cities of refuge. And this was in order to protect someone who kills another person accidentally. But then it also says how the avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. All right, that sounds kind of ominous. So who is this avenger of blood?
Yeah, what a question it is. And well, look, in those days and in that society, this avenger of blood was the closest relative of somebody who had been murdered. The near relative then had a duty to execute a murderer if someone in their family had been killed. They didn't stop to ask whether the killing was intentional or accidental sometimes, as in the case of manslaughter. So guilt may well have been assumed, and the near relative was given this assignment to go after the killer on behalf of the family. Now, the purpose of these cities of refuge was to provide protection for the one who had killed somebody unintentionally. They'd protect them from the avenger of blood until a trial could be held. Now, if that person was tried and found guilty, the avenger of blood was then allowed to carry out justice, which was execution. If they were tried and found innocent of intentional murder, then the accused person was allowed to remain in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest in that city, whereafter they could return home if they wanted to. And so that concept has actually really influenced Western legal codes, with the idea that people are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
Wow, that is fascinating, John, to consider how this stretches so far back and how it indeed does have influences on our legal system in this day. So thanks so much for sharing that. But I want us to move now into chapter 35, looking at verse 33, as it says that they shouldn't pollute the land with the blood. So what exactly is it talking about here? Is it ecology?
No, not talking about the environment or ecology. What it's talking about primarily is about how murder pollutes the land spiritually. The things that we do have an impact on the world around us. And the ecology movement, by the way, is not wrong in that we certainly are caretakers of the earth from the days of Adam and Eve on. And if we don't care for the environment, then we will suffer. But it is more important to take care of the pollution that lies within our sinful hearts. Remember in Genesis 4, when Cain kills his brother Abel, and God says how Abel's blood was crying out to him from the ground. And in ways that we don't fully understand, the shedding of innocent blood harms. It harms the earth. And it brings God's displeasure on nations. Chapter 35 says that atonement can't be made for the land on which blood has been shed, except by the blood of the murderer who shed it. God dwells on the earth with his people because he is present everywhere. He was with the Israelites in such a way that his law had to be taken very seriously. And one of the things that pollutes our lives and our relationship with God, as well as polluting the land, is murder of the innocent. And murder starts with a murderous heart. Jesus said, the thought of murder is the same as the act as far as God is concerned. And hatred is the seed of murder. So we need to guard against that in our hearts and deal with it if we sense that in our hearts.
Wow. Yeah, this is quite sobering, John. And once again, this is why time in the Bible is so valuable to us. We learn so many important, valuable lessons. And, just in finishing off our reflection for today, can we talk about the importance of the land of Israel today?
Well, yeah, let's do that. It's a land which has been so disputed over the centuries, and because of what it is and what it represents, will continue to be. And like the rest of the world, it's a land that belongs to God. And the relationship that the Israelites had with the land was a relationship of stewardship. They see the land as given to them by God in order that they would honor him in it and display to surrounding nations who God is. Now, is that being done today? And people will always discuss the boundaries of the land and whether it serves the purpose of showing the nations around who God is. You know, there are some variations in the Bible from one manuscript to another, but they all pretty much show the importance of Israel. And they achieved their maximum expansion during the time of King David, and they achieved their greatest economic expansion during the time of his son Solomon, during the reign of King Solomon. And that was a time when gold was so plentiful that silver was despised as being of little value. But over the years, through the neglect of God's word, Israel falls into a time of apostasy. And what happens? Well, what happens is the kingdom is divided, and it finally results in their being overrun by enemies. And when we look at the books of Kings and Chronicles, we will see the spiritual decline that occurs over many hundreds of years, and that leads to Israel being invaded by Assyria, and then led to Judah being taken captive to Babylon for 70 years. And when they return from Babylon, they didn't fall into the same kinds of idolatry that had got them into trouble before, but they didn't fully recover to the point where they once had been. And then 400 years after the last prophet Malachi, along comes Jesus Christ. And most of them in Israel reject Jesus. Some receive him. In fact, the first church was founded in Jerusalem, and it was made up entirely of Jews. And then the church spreads out to the surrounding nations, and there are churches in many countries in the world today. But what about Israel today? Well, many scholars understand that the land still belongs and believe the land still belongs to Israel. Others think that that no longer applies because of Israel violating the terms of the covenant that God had made with David. Well, look, it is a matter for debate, but the Old Testament prophets did foretell a general restoration of Israel in their land. Now, some might think that happened in 1948 in terms of a physical, geographical restoration, but I think a spiritual awakening is still in the future. N.T. Wright, a Bible scholar, once said this: "To open the Bible is to open a window towards Jerusalem, as Daniel did, no matter where our exile may have taken us. It was Jerusalem where our Saviour died and rose again. The most awesome act in the history of the human race took place there. But this old Jerusalem, like the rest of our world, will soon be no more. Ultimately, one day, there will be a new Jerusalem, and that will represent the final and everlasting reconciliation between God and his people forever in the glorious light and presence of his love. Hasten that day."
Well, that was beautifully said, John. Yeah, thank you so much for just leading us through these couple of chapters through the book of Numbers. I suppose now we can move ahead to today's episode summary.
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. We've been in Numbers chapters 33 through 36, and the theme has been between the past and the future. You know, God's purposes may seem to us like they take a while to manifest, but be confident in this: He will never fail. When we saw the Israelites plodding across the desert, getting hungry, thirsty, irritated, complaining, wanting to head back to the slavery that they'd escaped from, we wondered whether they'd ever make it to the promised land. There they were, surrounded by enemies trying to stop them. We have Balaam with his bad advice and armed conflict with the Ammonites and the Midianites. And we're wondering, wow, is God's promise really going to be fulfilled? Well, the answer to the question is always yes, friends. God always finishes what He begins. And if you trust Him, He will do the same right in your heart, right in your life as well. God's way of salvation is repentance towards God and faith in Jesus Christ. Acts chapter 20, verse 21. Come to Him, for He is waiting for you now.
Well, that concludes our journey through the book of Numbers. And what a fascinating look through this book it's most certainly been. And friend, we look forward to hearing your thoughts, your insights, your takeaways. And perhaps if you have any questions for us, you can leave them on our Facebook and Instagram pages. Simply search us at Mission 66. That is Mission 66 on Facebook and Instagram. And if it so happens that you may have missed an episode or two, well, please do not despair. You can listen to any past episodes wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And of course, you can listen to us at twr360.org. We look forward to joining with you in our next episode of Mission 66. Until then, may God bless you.
Let me remind you to head on over to mission66.org to download your study guide. It's free. Dive deeper into the Bible teaching of John Matthews and learn how it all relates to your Christian walk. Tag along with John and Esther on our Bible road trip episode by episode. Your study guide's waiting for you at mission66.org. That's where you can also post your questions or make a comment, and even help out with a donation to keep Mission 66's heart beating around the world. Hop on over to mission66.org. Mission 66 is a partnership of TWR and the ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao.